Welcome to Flow with Recess, a podcast to help you unlock your best self. Join Chief Psychology Officer of Recess, Matt Swartz, and our CEO, Kels Bethel, your hosts on this journey to flow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Flow with Recess. My name is Matt Swartz.
And I'm Kels.
And we're happy to have you on the podcast today. The next two podcasts will be focusing on our next foundation of flow. This time is peace. We just got off of 2 sessions around presence, and now we're on peace. So today we'll be discussing stress, which doesn't sound a lot like peace, but it is probably one of the number one factors that keeps us from peace. Is that fair to say, Kels?
Yeah, it does make sense. And one of the factors that actually stops us from achieving our goals in many ways too, you know?
Absolutely.
So let's jump in, Matt. Like, what exactly, we're talking about stress, right? So what exactly is this thing called stress? Like, if we had to define it and break it down a bit for us, because, you know, we use stress in all sorts of ways sometimes, right? So let's, really just clarify what exactly is stress.
Here's your 30-second bilateral moment. If you aren't already using headphones, now's the time to grab them and keep the flow going. Take this time to reconnect with your body and mind. Just listen to the sound move back and forth between your headphones and pay attention to the sensations in your body. Liked that? For more bilateral moments and full-length tracks, check out our bilateral playlist on YouTube. Links provided in the show notes.
So you start us off with an interesting problem, which is stress is a word like happiness or love or God that means so many different things to so many different people, and it's really quite a convoluted word. So I'll try to make it simple. And my definition may not agree with your definition, but that is because it's such a big word. When I talk about stress, what I am talking about is there's too much information to process. It's really that simple. And so that can be information usually coming from the outside of us, right? The sights, sounds, things, work we need to do, people we need to, how to-do lists we need to get to, loud flashing lights, neon, boom, bang, sex, drugs, rock and roll, whatever. But then almost always overlooked is the information that's coming from the inside, which is to say all of the stuff stored in our brain and our nervous system that pokes itself out constantly in the background in the same way that your heart's beating without, any effort at all. Your brain is doing all this stuff in the background without any effort at all. And that also leads to a lot of stress.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like a lot of the times we really think, as you're saying, we really think about, everything, work, life, we think about stress in a very external way, that these external things are affecting us. But what we don't really think about, as you mentioned, that is really about even how some of those past things are still somewhat stored in our bodies and continues to perpetuate and that internal stress that you talk about.
Yeah. Which is not to say things in front of you aren't stressing you out. They absolutely are. But the problem is, number one, what is your capacity to take in information? And number two, how well are you doing at working through it and processing through it, right? So you can have 2 identical people with the same, preconceptions and ways of being in the world. And then one person has a stress day and one person has an easy day, and they get the same thing, the same negative argument with their the significant other, and the stressed person goes into overload and the unstressed person doesn't. Or you can have people dealing with the same circumstance in front of them, like a car accident, that have two completely different backgrounds. And then, the one background causes them to react with stress and the other one doesn't. So there's a lot of factors that, and it's messy. So we don't like messy. It's a lot easier to say this thing, this bad thing in front of me, this work issue, this relationship issue. And so we tend to do that. We tend to externalize that stress.
Yeah. So I guess, that's a good way to segue into the next point in terms of exactly how does our body sort of react to these different things? Like how is it that, different people sort of react differently to this? How come, what makes me react a particular way and you react a different way,
Sure. Yeah.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, maybe we could talk about what is actually happening in our bodies that may sort of differentiate these responses in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I subscribe to several different models that help us understand stress. One of them is something called polyvagal theory. That highlights something called the window of tolerance, and I'll get to that in a second. I do these hour-long, 2-hour-long, 8-hour-long talks and workshops on stress. So I'm going to try to take all, put it into 1 minute, right? I subscribe to something called the nervous system scale that's kind of borrowed from a couple of different places, and then I've added my own things onto it. But it basically explains how we detect information, right? And then we try to work through that information. And we talked last time about attention and focus. We only have so much information processing capacity. So think of it like a 4-lane highway. So I start to put information on that 4-lane highway, and eventually it gets more and more crowded, more and more crowded, more and more crowded. And then when I get too many cars on that highway, it starts moving into stress. And then when there's so many cars on that highway, if I got a 6 lanes worth of cars in a 4-lane highway, and now it's all backed up, that starts to move into pain, right? And fundamentally, there are, really 3 different kinds of pain. There's structural pain, which is like, somebody hits my arm, right? The physical things happening in the world. There's chemical pain, which is like I ate bad food, or there's like an environmental toxin or whatever. And then there's informational pain. And so what we're talking about, it's not structural, it's not chemical, it's informational. Mm-hmm. And when there's too much information coming in, and then that moves from stress into pain. If we don't address the pain before it comes too big, it creates an injury. And those injuries, again, informational, or we could call those emotional injuries, get stored in our nervous system in the same way a structural injury is stored on our skin or in our bones. And then it then creates issues for the future, right? What would that mean? Well, let me quickly define what an injury is. An injury is something that prevents us from meeting a need. So if I have a structural injury in my leg that prevents me from meeting my need of getting food, right? If I have an emotional injury, that may prevent me from meeting my safety needs, or my connection needs, or my identity needs, or my self-actualization needs, right? But it's going to stop me from meeting a need. So as an example, right? Say I burn my hand on a stove, okay? That injury is going to create fear of going near the stove, right? Well, that makes sense. It makes sense to be scared of touching a stove that's on. But as that fear builds, if I don't address that fear, it can become anxiety. Anxiety is fear of fear. So now I'm afraid of the sensation of fear. I'm not able to make sense of what I'm feeling. So now I'm staying away from the stove completely. I don't know if it's on or not, right? The fear comes up. Is it on? Is it off? And I avoid that fear instead of going to check at the stove. I avoid that fear. It creates anxiety. Then slowly but surely, I don't want to use the stove anymore. Yeah. And then maybe I don't even want to go into the kitchen anymore. And this is how that injury grows and becomes what we refer to as trauma, which is basically too much pain for our brain and our bodies to process. And then we do different things. We panic, or we dissociate, or we get depressed, or we get angry, or any sort of thing in order to avoid the pain. that we don't know how to deal with. So most of us are walking around with these emotional injuries, these stored traumas in our body. And again, I'm using it, this could be touching a stove. This could be getting a presentation in fourth grade and having everybody laugh at you. This could be something bigger, like losing a parent, right? But these things, then we're walking around with them, and it's like we have a cup or a water bottle, and that cup or water bottle is filled up 40% or 60% or 80%. And then we go to dump in the daily stress, and based on how full that cup already is from our emotional injuries, determines how much room we have to pour into that cup until it overflows. And that's stress response in real time is initiated.
That makes sense. And it also sounds like, I guess, unaddressed stress, it could be something that is like big and impactful that sort of pushes you straight down the continuum, or it could be something that is like sort of persistent and consistent as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Unaddressed over time too.
People all the time are like, you ever just sit there in silence and you start thinking about that weird, embarrassing thing you did a couple of years ago? Nobody remembers, right? But it can be like a bunch of little embarrassing little things, or it can be, it can be persistent daily stress. Like, it's no big deal if you go to work one day and your boss yells at you, but if you're going to work every day and your boss is yelling at you, now it's a problem, right?
So I guess, that makes sense. So I guess what we're talking about too is kind of like what you mentioned too, in terms of how we deal with that. Like you spoke briefly about your window of tolerance and polyvagal and all of that. I guess that would sort of get into how we cope with that stress. Like how are those things?
Yeah. So rather than going into polyvagal, because number one, I'm not I use polyvagal. I'm not a polyvagal expert. I don't want to turn this podcast into a polyvagal podcast. We can maybe talk about that more next time, right? I'm more just kind of shouting it out for people. Again, come to my longer presentations. I'll wax on polyvagal or the window of tolerance, right? But the idea is, in polyvagal, the simple parts are: am I content? Am I aroused into some type of fight or flight response, right? Hey, I need to fix something. I need to change something. Or am I under aroused into a shutdown response? And there are, of course, gradations of that. The shutdown response almost always comes after the over aroused response. If fight or flight doesn't work, then we go to shutdown, right? And then the more we go to shutdown, the more we condition that over time, and the more automatic that response becomes. And I can go into how do I determine where I'm at and all of that at some other point. But what's important to recognize is, number one, am I stressed, right? And then number two, why? Now, I don't want to make stress a bad guy, because it's not. Stress is a useful and essential process in the human body. If you weren't stressed, you wouldn't do anything, right? Contentment creates inactivity, right? So if there's no stress in your system, that's a bad thing. You'll just lay and eat Lays all day. Like if you weren't stressed about money, or you weren't stressed about what other people thought about you, or you were, if you didn't care about, if you weren't worried about making friends, you wouldn't make friends. If you weren't, right? So we need some sort of stress. And again, not too much, right? There are plenty of studies that show us there are benefits to stress. And the question is, am I working through stress effectively? Am I utilizing it effectively, right? Basically, am I letting it build up with no mechanisms for right-sizing it? Because if it's right-sized, if it's the right amount of stress, there's tons of benefits, right? Good stress increases performance. We talk about an inverted U, which is to say, if you draw an upside down U on a graph, right? On the left side, no stress, bad performance. On the far right side, too much stress, bad performance. Right in the middle, some stress, best performance, right? You could think about sports athletes, or you could think about creative types, or you could think about professionals. We need some level of stress, right? Always talking about the growth mindset, right? We need some sort of challenge to help engage us in order to grow. Does that make relative sense, Kels?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that it's an interesting way for persons to think about it as well. The fact that, or to come to terms with the fact that we do need some sort of stress to even be able to, reach our goals, to get up in the morning, to make any next step to grow. We still need that sort of pressure. We need a little bit of pressure to move.
Right. So the problem isn't stress. The problem is how we're dealing with
How
stress.
we're dealing with it,
Right.
yeah.
So, thinking about our current issues, right, our sort of the cultural soup we find ourselves swimming in.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that in the last 20 years, the amount of stimuli we're taking in has grown exponentially, right? And then even before that, the time between our parents' generation and ours, when we were kids, there were, for me, 50 plus television stations. When my mom was growing up, there were 5.
Mm-hmm.
And before that, there was 1 or 0, right? So, the amount of information that we now have to compile, and then the immediacy of that, email and cell phones. And I can still remember when my dad got his first cell phone, that big honking thing in his car.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, you just left a message and people got back when they got back. And, today we have this expectation of like, you get back to me in a day, something's wrong. Like, it's like, oh, I'm just hanging out over there,
Yeah.
So all of the stimuli, the immediacy by which we're expected to respond to it, and then the lack of culturally, I don't want to say enforced, but sort of culturally recommended processing time. We don't have real rest. Our rest is sitting in front of the television, which is just what? Taking in more information.
True. Yeah.
So when do we rest, right? Some people rest by, these days by doing some sort of physical activity, going for a walk, going for a run, right? That's more restful, honestly, than sitting in front of the television.
So true. Yeah.
So, too much stimuli, got to respond to it too quickly, not enough time to process. And those are the real issues that are making stress an epidemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
In today's modern world.
Mm-hmm. So there are some benefits to stress, but there really are some drawbacks in terms of, what it does to us. So we kind of spoke about, the benefits of it. We know that we need it for performance. We know we needed to move, right?
Right.
What about some of the drawbacks? So if there are any more benefits to stress that,
Yeah. So short term, right? Too much stress will decrease performance. Once you've moved from like the middle of the stress category into extreme stress or into pain, you're diminished performance, right? At work, at home, all across the board, period, right? Plenty of studies that show this. Relationship issues, right? We know this kick the dog syndrome. We bring the pain into our relationships and we become more disconnected with our partners, our children, our friends, our, whatever, right? Those relationships, our work, colleagues, right? And then physical health issues. I mean, I do this presentation where I go through this list of, like basically 40 physical health issues. And the answer is everything, right? Stress can make everything worse. All the, from cancer to diabetes to bone issues to, all of this, right? Stress impacts every cell in your body, and every cell in your body impacts your physical health. So, it can kill you, right? So, stress will kill you. Seriously. And, we often in the literature to differentiate that, we call that toxic stress, right? Toxic stress will kill you. So there's, a lot of serious drawbacks. and again, for a lot of us, probably what does it look like? It looks like lack of fulfillment, pain, lack of direction, dissatisfaction with relationships, challenges sleeping, challenges eating, physical health issues in our body, with our stomach, with our heart, with our lungs, with, any movement, right? There's all these sort of things that people will probably recognize as a symptom of stress once they realize, oh, yeah, I mean, that's what this is.
What's going on? Yeah. I don't know. It is really interesting because I'm also thinking as we're talking about like my personal experience with, stress recently and, how things have been going. I feel like for me, I relate to, stress being that initial motivator or driver for sure, because I think as somebody who, I've always been one of those persons who was some sort of a procrastinator. So I needed like these deadlines. I needed these, sort of circumstances in which that would just push me to achieve my goals. So I definitely realized that I do need that. And it's interesting that I didn't consider it stress, right? I would just think like, okay, I need this little kick to be able
Yeah.
to do what I'm doing. But what I've noticed recently especially is that eventually that is like a short-term thing. So I think this is what you're talking about in terms of the you. But I think that eventually what happens is that just leads to like shutdown. So I'm able to sustain that. I'm able to use the stress to motivate me, to get me into a state of, performance. But then eventually I can't sustain that. Like I end up burning out or shutting down or, and then that then leads to just complete avoidance. So like I realized that during the pandemic, something like that happened, right? I was working on I couldn't physically work on my other startup before recess. Like I couldn't physically like bring myself to do anything. I had to do a bunch of stuff and time would pass and I just couldn't physically bring myself to even engage in particular task or, and I realized that I was just in this state of burnout. At least I think that is what is happening. But I feel like, it starts off like driver, then it's like this kind of burnout, and then I just start to avoid it altogether. Like I'm not even focused on it. I don't know. Does that sound right? Does that even
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're just outlining the structure of a particular response to stress, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that need the stress to motivate, which asterisk, then you end up creating stresses in your life in order to motivate you, right? And so people who talk about this sort of profile of like, oh, I need a little kick to motivate me. Well, how often are you creating dysfunctional kicks in your life to get you started because that's what you're used to, right? And then comes, like you say, fight. So I'm up in fight or flight, I'm up in fight or flight, blah, 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 and burnout shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then I begin, like you said, this is the example of the stove. Right now, I'm not even going in the kitchen.
Yeah.
I don't even want to look at that business. I don't even want to talk to those people. I'm avoiding the phone call. Right.
Exactly.
And it's because of all this collected pain around the thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I know this wasn't exactly what you're talking about, but permission to go off on a small tangent?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So, we've shared this before, but it's worth sharing again. And I didn't get into this enough with the attention episode, so I just want to drop this off and we can revisit it later. I do not believe in laziness. I believe in demotivation. I believe in being emotionally demotivated, and that procrastination is a behavioral response to being unmotivated because of emotion. And that can be a deficit of positive emotion, or it can be a surplus of negative emotion. And so usually it's a surplus of negative emotion. And then what happens is I don't sit down and address that negative emotion. Instead, I find bigger negative emotion to push me through that negative emotion, right? There's a study that you and I were looking at that shows that for entrepreneurs, negative emotion is effective short-term, but not long-term.
Yeah.
The long-term positive emotion is effective, right? So when we don't sit down and work through that negative emotion, we end up creating this spiral where it's almost like these pain points have a life of their own, and they grow and they grow and they grow and they grow. Whereas, and then cause shutdown and avoidance and all of these things.
Yeah.
Whereas if we just learn how to sit down with the initial negative thing that's blocking us from the motivation in the beginning, rather than forcing our way through with more negatives, we would likely find better results in the long term.
Yeah, yeah. It's so interesting as we were talking about that. It's so interesting how the factors of flow come. And I know I'm jumping forward, but we'll come back. It's so interesting that we're speaking about peace, and last time we spoke about presence, because even even being mindful enough to stop at that point is even helpful in terms of addressing that stress. So, and maintaining that peace. So you could see how all these things are interconnected,
It's so you're dead on, right? If I don't have the mindfulness, the presence to be able to go, oh, I'm in stress.
Yeah.
oh, I'm in pain. That's why I'm not working.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm just going off of old patterns, like patterns I developed in grade school that went, too bad, get your homework done. Right. Like, and I've just been replicating too bad, get your homework done. And I've never taken the pause in between the feeling and the homework. Right. Which is now the feeling and work. Right. I can grow that mindfulness, which is initially painful because then you have to feel the pain, right? Yeah. Why do people not want to grow their awareness? They don't want to feel the pain.
Yeah.
And, you know, I want peace. Well, what if I told you in order to get peace, you've got to work through pain? No, I don't want it. Give me just peace. Thank you. No pain.
Peaceful. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that's the challenge you're running into. But if you can bring that mindfulness into that moment, you could go, oh, there's some junk here. I shouldn't just do the work.
Exactly.
Sometimes I may need to, right? But other times I may go, the best thing to do right now is sit down for 10 minutes and feel through this. And just, you know, again, pull up recess, do a little boop, 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 and work through a little bit of that pain. Yeah. And you won't be able to work through all of it, but you can at least identify it and begin to work through it so you can come back to it later on your evening walk or whatever.
Yeah, that makes sense. That it's really interesting. And I guess before, I mean, you could share your experience with stress, but even, you know, as we're talking about it, I'm also thinking about how I saw this same dynamic also happen, not only for me, but within, you know, a collective standpoint in a company, in an organization. Like, you know, I saw it with like my parents' company, for example, you know, very high stressed at times because of personalities. But, you know, I saw that eventually everybody was pushing through, and that sort of led to this collective shutdown almost, you know, that it wasn't just one person shutting down. It's like the entire company just like buckled under that same sort of burnout and shutdown. And that's also an interesting phenomenon to notice.
We would never, if you have a factory and you knew that a machine had a particular stress tolerance, you would never go too far beyond that. Right? In a short surge, yes, but not long term, right? But we don't think about that with people, likely because we have trouble measuring it. But even then, like, we have the measurement tools. Most corporations don't give a crap about how stressed. They're just going to eat the cost. They're going to lose the employee, eat the cost, get a new employee, meanwhile destroying people, you know, and destroying teams. And it just, for any younger, more aware company that's willing to look at it differently, oh my God, you'll save millions of dollars.
Exactly.
Right? By figuring out what the stress tolerances of each of your employees and each of your teams and not pushing them beyond that tolerance and helping to teach them the skills they need to be able to work through that stress so that they can come back to the table with more capacity. Most people want to thrive and be creative in even those, you know, corporate roles. But when you don't give them the ability because you don't give them the skills and you don't give them the opportunity, I mean, it's going to crash and burn every single time. And you see most of the time companies go through these waves and they just come to accept it. Oh, this is another stress wave. Oh, this is another, purge. This is another, it's dysfunction. That's
exactly.
Dysfunction.
No, it's so true. I'm seeing it right now. Like, it's crazy. But what about you? What about your experience with stress, Matt? Like, give us some insights and some.
Until I was 28, I probably didn't really know what stress was, even though I'd been practicing, you know, I'd been a therapist since I was 22, right? It was my wife. My wife helped me really see how embedded I was in stress. And at that time, it just felt, you know, I was swimming in water. It just was what it was. And as I've slowly backed out of the room, I'm like, when I think about where I was at 4 years ago, I'm like, oh my God. Like, it was all like, it was just like, I couldn't have a cup of coffee without having a panic attack. Like, that's how, you know, much it was. And in going through deeper trauma work and peeling back the layers. So initially stress management, right? Just deal with but that's what I was doing with my practice until I was 28. I was teaching people, you know, I'd done CBT for anxiety. I was teaching people coping skills, stress management, whatever, but I was still swimming in a sea of stress. I hadn't even thought about some of these ideas that to me are now, you know, like absolutely essential for the work I do. And that was going through the trauma work that helped me with that, right? What I discovered in going through the trauma work was I've actually been in a constant state of stress since middle school. Like there's been no point since middle school that I haven't been in stress, right? I've had stomach issues ever since then and before. And that part of that's family challenges. I think a bulk of that is school. I grew up in a very high achieving district and doing honors classes and all of this, but, and then I also learned that I come to, as we were talking about, use stress to mitigate my focus issues, right? Like you're talking about, I grew up with ADHD. And so I just wait until I have to do the homework and then I do the homework. And that's how I got through it, because I was more scared of failing than I was of, not doing the work. And that doesn't work for everybody, because there's some people that are scared of failing. They fail a couple times, they realize it doesn't hurt them and they keep doing it. Well, me, I've stayed away from failure my entire life. So, I never knew. I still literally this morning woke up from a dream that I was in high school and I didn't know what my classes were. And I was going to fail my classes because I didn't know what they were and where to, I still have school stress dreams, right? I'm sure a lot of you guys do. So, and I've slowly through the last 4 years, but especially through the pandemic, been working to take layer off of layer of that. And it's been complex and it's been complicated, right? In a team, in an organizational situation, for me, what I find myself doing is I absorb the stress of everybody around me and I make it my issue. And then I try to fix everybody else's stress. When the problem really is you continue to put yourself in situations, in systems that are overstressed, that don't want to change that. And you're trying to go in there and change those systems. That's how they've always been. That's how they're always going to be. You need to move into systems that don't work that way. Or grow new things, right? And that's, I think we've done a pretty good job with Recess of not, trying to overstress each other and being good when everybody needs breaks. And if that means we need to slow down our timeline, we slow down our timeline. Because ultimately, if we explode, I think we just have that felt sense of I don't want to damage anybody here. We're gonna take this at the right space. So that's been my experience with stress.
Yeah, that makes sense, Matt. Makes sense. And I guess if you're talking about that whole concept of what you're talking about with Recess, with us, slowing down timelines, but does that go against flow? You know what I mean? Because you also need that sort of you need that goal or that intention. You need, to be able to get into flow. So what is the relationship between stress and your goal and flow and Recess and all of this thing when it comes to stress?
Want to get even deeper into your flow? Learn more about today's episode on our blog, The Science of Productivity. Find out more about today's topic by visiting our blog, Boosting Attention, Focus, and Concentration. Our mental health app can help. Here, you'll get more insights and tips on how you can maintain your flow state every day.
If you think about really healthy flow state, there is some stress. There's a goal. There's feedback about how well you're doing in reference for that goal, but it's a felt thing. It feels good. When it feels good and when it feels bad. And when you're in flow, it feels good. It's okay. And sometimes it's I don't know. Am I going to get there? Am I going to, so it's not that there isn't confusion but when you're in flow, the stress feels like you're on the right track. Yeah. It feels handleable. It feels like it's moving you forward. And then when you begin to add on too much stress, that's what peels you out of the flow. And I think, again, there are subtleties, but I think you can feel that. I think it's like, you ever been running really, really fast speed and then you sort of do that thing where you trip on your own feet and you have to regain your gait, right? Yeah. It's kind of like that. Remember that in flow, challenge and skill are supposed to be matched. And so there should be some stress from the challenge, but that should be mitigated by the skill in facing the challenge.
Right.
And so if we don't feel that way, if the challenge is too big, creating too much stress, or the skill is too small, right? We're going to feel too much stress.
Mm-hmm.
If the skill is too big and the challenge is too small, we're not going to feel any.
Mm-hmm.
And so neither of those are in flow, right? We want to find that right balance. So, too much stress can bring us out of flow. That's no surprise. But also, too little stress can bring us outside of flow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Yeah. And then, so I guess, yeah, so it's about creating that perfect balance. All the stars have to align for us to be able to get into flow state. And I guess this is where what we're doing at Recess is to really help us to find that balance and to get into that zone. So how exactly, maybe you could get into more in terms of our approach to getting us into managing stress, getting us into that peaceful state so that we could get into flow state. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So let's go back to polyvagal and the window of tolerance. And if you guys are listening, you're like, what is he talking about? Google the window of tolerance so that you can see this in visual format, because that'll make it so much easier, right? If I'm over aroused, if I'm stressed, right? If I'm in fight or flight, if I'm go, right? What I want to make sure that I have the right amount of that energy, because if there's too much of it, then I'm going to, maybe shut down, or I'm going to overstress myself and then burn out, right? So in those cases, we want to notice when the stress is too high, and we want to bring it down a little so that it can be, again, in that sort of the top of that upside down U curve, right? So it's the right amount of stress. What's the right amount of stress? Different for different people in different contexts. So I can't give you some sort of like magic answer. You actually kind of have to learn to feel it out with yourself. Based on different circumstances. So I would think about, the circumstances that, you've done really well, or you were in flow. Look back, look at the level of stress and go, okay, so that's my hot zone, right? And there may be some variation, right? But if you're beyond that, if you're too stressed, how do you know beyond that? Well, you're not doing your stuff. That's how you know. It doesn't feel good. It feels bad. You feel exhausted, even though there's more work to do, right? We're going to have you sit down in front of Recess, pull up the peace session, go into the bilateral stimulation, and focus on the feelings of stress in your body, right? Pay attention to the physiological experience of stress. At the beginning, you may be totally ignorant of it. But as you do more of the processing, you'll learn, it'll teach your body. And you'll notice, oh, I always feel it in my chest or in my shoulders or in my jaw or in my stomach. Everybody's different. There are definitely typical zones. Stomach's a big one. Chest is a big one. Jaw, shoulders are big ones, but everybody's different. Some people feel it in their hands. Some people feel it in their feet. Some people feel it in their head, right? And basically with Recess, you just notice where you're feeling that in your body and just allow the bilateral to do its work. And what the bilateral will naturally do is naturally help you feel the feeling in a safe way. I was just listening to a podcast from Dr. Andrew Huberman talking about how they have fMRI brain scan data to show that, this bilateral movement decreases the activation in your amygdala, no question about it, which basically tells your fight or flight system you're safe, right? And so using that, continuing to let your brain and your body know you're okay, you're safe, is basically taking some of that time I was talking about to process and empty stuff out of the cup, right? Even emptying 10% off of the cup may be enough to help you push forward, finish the work you need to do. But then come do something calming, do something. Don't just keep pushing through, right? But you could use the Recess to calm you. You could use that a couple of times a day, but then really you want to bake in bigger practices throughout your life in order to help diminish the deeper stress, and then go do the trauma work, go do the, deeper therapy to remove some of those emotional injuries from your body. That's not our job. That's not what we're doing. We're just helping you to get the 10 or 20% off the top. And I think you'll find when you finish a peace session, you should feel calmer, with one exception. If you are in the shutdown zone of the window of tolerance, that means you have to go back through the stress zone in order to get to the calm zone. What does that mean? If you're in shutdown mode and you do the peace session, it might jack you up before it calms you down. depending on who you are and where you're at and what's going on, right? So some users report, I actually feel more stressed than when I started. Yeah, because you were in the shutdown mode and now you are aware and engaged with the stress, whereas before you were in total shutdown. Now, good and bad. Bad, it feels bad to be stressed. Good is now you can deal with it. Now you can begin working through that, whether that means doing another peace session or going on a walk or doing some yoga or whatever is helpful to help you regulate your brain and your body. So best case, recess will help you diminish your stress. Worst case, recess will show you the stress you didn't know you were feeling because you've numbed it out.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, so maybe we could end off with some tips for people. Like, what are some tips to find our flow, to get, to deal with some of the stress besides recess? For me, I feel like, as you mentioned that, even with recess, you may realize that you do a session, your stress sort of increases. At that point, for me, that might be a time for me to get physical. I may go on a walk, I might go in the pool by me, I may do a couple laps in the pool at home just to get my body moving. That has been helpful, even better than, going for a walk sometimes. And for me, I think it's just at that point when I feel that built up stress, it's just about getting physical.
Love it. Yeah, I wish I had a pool. Honestly, just hearing you say that, oh my God, that'd be great. Just jump into the pool, do a couple of laps, jump out, right? Because that's more physical than just taking a walk, right? Going for a run, maybe a little different. But, when you can get your full body involved anytime, again, that's why I love like yoga, or I love like other ways of getting your full body involved. That can be really, really helpful. So yeah, love that. For me, it's just growing the awareness, right? So I always say, like, try checking in with your body 3 times a day. In the morning, in the middle of the day, at the end of the day. Where is my stress level at? 0 to 10, right? Is it super high? Is it super low? Is it somewhere in the middle? And then what do I need to do about that, right? And usually it's just taking small breaks to relax, right? Asterisk, not with your phone, right? Taking 10 minutes to just sit. And that's why, these days teaching it's funny. I think teaching meditation is not what it was 50 years ago. 50 years ago was actually meditation. Now it's just like, just sit there, man. Like, just sit there for 10 minutes. I can't do it. I know. Just sit there for 5 or 10 minutes. I've got myself this cute little pond and some trees out there. I just turn and I look at them for about 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Right? Just enough stimuli, right? Listen to some music you like for 10 minutes. Go on a walk around the house, around the neighborhood, whatever. 10 minutes. And that's different than the stress relief that you're talking about, Kels, with some like high energy physical activity. This is just try to relax. Just try to be wherever you're at with that stress level. We're not even trying to improve it. We're just trying to know about it.
Yeah. And what about... All right. And what about for teams, we're just thinking about, we're speaking about ourselves personally, but also for teams. How could a person who's conscious of, a business, a team lead, a manager, if they're conscious about stress and managing their stress of their team, what is something that they could do?
Yeah. So I think educating is first, right? Educating people about stress so that they understand. And again, in the same way that you would want to educate somebody who's driving a car about a gas tank, right? Imagine driving a car and nobody tells you that if your gas tank hits empty, you're stuck, right? So like educating people about stress, bringing in somebody, I do like some stress management stuff that helps, because what it does is it says, the basics of stress management is this isn't all on the company, right? This is on you on some level, right? You're stressed, but there's a balance, right? It's about me, but it's also about my leader and it's also about the company. And that's where it gets complex, right? So what I would recommend is educating staff, giving them some coping skills, but then also appraising stress levels on a, is it a weekly basis? Like, how stressed do you feel this week? Right? How can I, and then being, as a leader, being aware of projects and tasks and where to put those projects and tasks. And of course, the number one worry is like, oh my God, if I do that, it'll give people an excuse to slack off. Well, it'll give people an excuse to heal the stuff that's already a problem, right? If they want that drive to stop working and a drive to slack off is a natural drive that says, I'm overburdened, right? And for some people, you may look at them and be like, well, they don't have too many projects. They don't have too many assignments. Yeah, it's past pain. It's past bullshit. It's all the stuff they're holding on to. And I'm not saying you should be, as a leader, responsible for managing any of that, but you can definitely set limits and set requirements around the objectives and then say, hey, I think you need more help, exactly. Right? Like, I think if you want to be a high performing member of the team, I think you have to know it's incumbent upon you to go and get help for whatever is filling 70% of your cup.
Exactly.
I don't think you're stupid. I think you're stressed.
Exactly. And it's so important now, as you mentioned it, that it's not really the company's fault, but it's also important to understand that the general nature of society that we are in now, it would come up consistently with your staff. Right. We're in a place where, the WHO, it's basically an epidemic. WHO suggests that it's about $1 trillion per year is the cost of productivity loss just due to stress and burnout. So if you are a business owner or if you are managing a team, it is something that is going to come up. And if you want to hire people and you want them to perform, it is something that you should consider, being proactive with and being considerate about as well.
So small stuff, right? Just to get back to the nitty gritty for everybody, right? Again, we said this last time with focus, so we're just doubling down. Normalize breaks, right? Normalize 10-minute stretch breaks, normalize 15-minute walking breaks, normalize 10-minute breathing breaks, right? Normalize breaks. You will increase your productivity. If you look at every single freaking study on productivity increases with the right amount of breaks and decreases when we're not allowed to. Because here's the deal. They're either going to take a break and breathe, or they're going to take a break and go on Reddit or YouTube or whatever. People will take the break, right? So are you going to teach them how to do it in a productive way or an unproductive way? And company culture will inform that, right? And then from there also, that break and also explaining, that's processing time, right? Normalizing, I want to finish this project. Well, you may need to stop and think about the project rather than just barreling into it, which sounds still elementary. But again, company culture. There are companies that don't encourage that. And there are companies that say, yeah, you need, have a half an hour brainstorm, then go back to work, right? These are super essential, just normal, basic things that can, a leader can take on and can, build into team culture and then possibly company culture over time.
Yes, yeah, that's a good one, Matt. All right. Well, I think this was a really good session, Matt. What do you think?
I hope it was helpful. I know there's a lot to say about stress. I've got a ton to say about stress, but I think the end-all be-all here would be raise your awareness to stress, understand that stress is when you're getting too much information, understand that you need to either slow the information intake or give yourself time to process, and that this is cumulative over your lifespan. And that most of us come to the table hearing this podcast conversation, you've got too much in the cup from all of the years that you haven't cleaned it out. You haven't gone to the dentist and you got a bunch of plaque, right? So there may be deep digging you have to do to work through the yucky stuff while you are learning the skills to not put too much more in the cup.
Yeah. All right. Well, it was a good session, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thank you all for being with us. This has been Flow with Recess, and we'll be excited to have you back for next week, where we're going to continue to talk about peace, but we're going to talk about this sort of deeper idea of, am I just managing my stress or am I healing my stress? And what does that look like? And how do we do that?
Thanks for tuning in to Flow with Recess. By the way, your flow doesn't have to end here. Our Recess app helps listeners unlock their most productive selves by reducing anxiety and improving their focus. You can find out more about our app as well as more resources to support you on your journey by visiting our website withrecess.com. Links to our bilateral playlist and this week's blog post are also found in our show notes. Until next time, find your flow and get unstuck with Recess.